All right. So we talked about consciousness. We're talking about cognition generally, this section of the class. And now I want to talk about ways that our reasoning might be less robust than we think it is and more predictably irrational than we think it is. So, similar to the previous lecture, in which we had um, situations where we have consciousness perceived where we don't think that it exists, and vice versa, that can be reliably produced. We're talking about that with reasoned actions. This is going to be a little bit different than what we are used to seeing, um, but it will connect to various points throughout the class, as we'll see. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about economics and psychology. And a lot of that is just going to ground where this discussion was coming from because it's tangential to cognitive science for most of its history, but I think it's very, very relevant to it. And it's just fun too. So again, the idea of divided mind is going to be relevant here. I'm thinking about the mind as a computer, the computational theory of mind, and then cognitive science, right? So cognitive science seems to imply some sort of rationality. This is going to connect to later discussions on emotions, on embodied cognition, on Descartes' error, on evolutionary psychology, on neuroethics, on a bunch of things. So let's get started. Early economists, and not even that early, actually fairly recent economists, including a lot of economists that are still living, like to think about human decision-making in this view known as rational choice theory. It's still taught, and you will still hear the concept of rational choice theory. Some basic assumptions that we know to be false, right? Namely that our psychology is sublimated, is like hidden away, and we imagine situations where individuals have full information about the consequences of their actions. They have sufficient time and capability to weigh alternatives, and their decisions are forward-looking. So, rational choices, according to rational choice theory, are ones that a purely logical computer would make. These are choices by definition that benefit the agent. So if I offer you a penny or not a penny, you will take the penny because by definition, a penny is more than zero, and you prefer more than zero. This is rational choice theory. There's a lot to be said for it. A lot of economics bases its some assumptions on emergent features of rational choice theory where individual irrationalities get washed out. Sometimes we even think about individual humans as being rational, although economists have always said that individuals have some irrationalities to them. We're emotional, of course. There's some very simple objections to rational choice theory. Some of them are that it doesn't apply to reality, that it's not psychologically plausible, but there's some logical objections too. So check out this one, right? Like let's say I have a fair coin, I flip it and it lands heads, you get $1. And every time I flip it and it lands heads, you get 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, etc. Dollars. You keep doubling the money, and it goes on forever. But the first time you see a tails, the game ends, and the game is over. So, rational choice theory. One of the weird consequences of it is that in this particular scenario, it is considered, quote, rational to pay, say, $1 million to enter this game, even though you might only win $1. And the reason is there is a potentially infinite payoff. That seems a little strange. There's a lot of other similar objections we can make, right? We can make objections that are purely math-based, purely logical, some that are psychological. The point is that there are some untoward assumptions. And people knew this. And in fact, they were willing to accept that perhaps there were some problems, that perhaps we should think about humans not as rational agents, but as boundedly rational agents. So of course we don't have perfect information. Of course we don't have enough time or capability to calculate some huge sums. Of course we prefer some outcomes to others inconsistently, and we're error prone. That said, economists thought, and psychologists and people in general thought that we made decisions that were good enough, considering our situation, our bounds. And then in the 70s, a couple of people in Israel, a couple of scientists that were from areas just outside of economics, started exploring these ideas. And they developed an entire field that is called behavioral economics, which we'll talk about. And in the series of papers, they challenged some of these central assumptions of economic theory, that of human rationality. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. Tversky sadly died in '96, so he wasn't allowed to win the Nobel Prize, which can only be given to living people. By the way, this is Nobel Prize week, so place your bets. The Nobel Prize in Economics is given next Monday. But their research shows that sometimes information is insufficient even for limited rationality. A lot of judgments are not goal-directed or problem-solving, and the human errors are systematic. That is, sometimes we regularly, again and again, go against what rational choice theory suggests that we should be, how we should reason. So relevant here is this concept of a heuristic. A heuristic is a substitution of an easy question for a difficult one. We don't have a lot of time to make all sorts of decisions, so we make quick decisions for most situations. We know more or less how to get about our day. And so if we can take shortcuts, we will. And a lot of people, a lot of this research shows that most of our decisions are these shortcuts, these thinking fast ways of reasoning, which cut a lot of time out of our day. We don't spend infinite time calculating how best to alphabetize our soup cans or whatever. But it also leads to systemic and predictable errors. And so that's going to be what we're going to talk about next. This is going to be a fairly long section, so I suspect this video will go on beyond 20 minutes. I apologize. Let's talk about biases and heuristics. And we're going to talk about 3, and then the next section we're going to talk about the other bias, the other issue, loss aversion. So the 3 biases are simple: similarity, availability, and anchoring. Similarity, we group things based on our previous experience of things that seem to be similar going together. Availability, we tend to think that things that are easy to think about are the way that they are, and that it is not just our mind playing tricks on us. And then anchoring is you can link somebody to an initial impression, and all judgment goes from that particular impression to how they're going to reason about it later. We'll talk about each of these in turn, and then in the next section, which will probably be the next video, we'll talk about loss aversion, about how we are afraid of losing. All right, so similarity. So we are really bad, it turns out, at estimating certain events under particular circumstances. We'll go over each of these. We ignore prior probabilities. We ignore sample sizes. We don't understand chance. We don't understand predictive accuracy. And then we have an illusion of certain sorts of validity. So let's talk about these in order. Let's say that there is a pandemic presently that means that you can't take classes in person. And you are worried that you might have the disease in this pandemic. And you take a test. And the test says that it is 99% accurate. Okay? So 99% of the time, it detects the disease when it is present and does not detect it when it is not present. Okay, so it's important that I am not saying anything that is against the current situation in coronavirus world. This might have been a correct representation of the scenario back in February, maybe March. This is not how you should reason about it right now. But let's say it's March and you decide to take this test. You know that only 1 in 10,000 people have this disease, but the test is 99% accurate and it comes back positive. What are the chances you actually have the disease? I've asked this to many classes and you can like pause and think about it for a second. But a lot of people think that it's 99% because the test says that it's 99% accurate. Some people say 90% because they see that it is a choice that's not the top choice, but it's pretty close to what they think, so they'll choose it. Very, very, very few people say the correct answer, which is 1%. The reason that is the correct answer is because people ignore a simple feature of mathematics that 1 in 1,000 people. So try to ignore the math that I'm showing here. If only 1 in 1,000 people have it, that means that if you test 1,000 people, 999 will not have it. Now, in this scenario, which again does not reflect what it would be like to take the test in a world where 3% of people in Nevada have the pandemic, in this scenario, it's only 0.01% of the population that has this disease. And so you think, okay, I test 1,000 people. All right, test 10,000 people. The test results are 99% accurate. So I get 9,900 negative results. In this scenario, you would expect 999 of those to be false negatives, or sorry, false positives, and one of those, no, sorry, 990 of them to be false positives and 10 of those to be false negatives. Why? Because you get the wrong result on about 100 of them. There we go. You would expect 99 false positives and 1 false negative. Because if it's 99% accurate, then out of 10,000 tests, about 100 are going to be wrong. And the wrongness based on your assumption that only 1 in 10,000 people have it is likely to skew towards false positives rather than false negatives. If you live in Nevada in October of 2020, on the other hand, where more people have this disease, the math doesn't work this way anymore. Then it becomes closer to 50-50 that you actually have it versus not. Importantly in this, you don't have any symptoms. But yeah, it's weird reasoning. It's hard to think about it. And that was a case where I gave you relevant information. It turns out people make this mistake even with irrelevant information. There's 70 engineers and 30 lawyers in a room. And then I say, Dick is a 30-year-old man, married with no children, high ability, high motivation, promises to be quite successful in his field, well liked by his colleagues. What are the odds that he is an engineer versus a lawyer? People will say, well, I don't know, 50-50. No, I literally just told you it was 70-30. So we ignore prior probabilities, the likelihood of the setup. We get trapped in the most recent question that we're asked. I give you other things, right? We don't understand sample size. So heads, tails, heads, 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 tails, heads, tails, heads, 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 tails, 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 tails. Which of these is more likely? The answer is A, because it only requires 5 50-50, so it's only 1 in 128 rather than 1 in 256 likelihood that you'll get this exact result. It's much more likely, it's twice as likely to get that result as opposed to B and C. Twice as likely. We don't understand sample size. A hospital delivers 15 patients per day, 15 babies per day, the other one delivers 50 in 1 calendar year. Which hospital is more likely to have more days with 60% boys? So if it's 50 deliveries per day, you would need to have 30 boys and 20 girls to be delivered. Versus if it's 15 deliveries per day, you would only need to have, I should have done the math before this, 9 boys to 6, so 9 to 6, as opposed to 30 to 20. We misunderstand sample sizes for A. We also think that chance implies that there's going to be sort of a back and forth, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, when in reality, each of these events is equally likely. It's just that some of them look more random to us than others. This one's depressing for me. It turns out that if you had evaluated me after the first 5 minutes of class, and then asked to evaluate how good I would be after 5 years of teaching, you would give basically the same answer. You would say that I was wonderful. Despite the fact that presumably in 5 years I'll learn some stuff. Like I'll learn not to have looping GIFs on my slides that are very distracting. Lastly on this, people will tend to increase their confidence in a judgment more when given repeated information than when given diverse sources of information. So it actually means that the more information you consume from different sources, you're more likely to be less confident than somebody just repeating the same things over and over again. So the more you hear it, the more you believe it. And if you think you've heard it several times, you think that it's more likely to be true. Confidence, like the confidence in given repeated information, even if it's not new information at all, increases relative to situations where you're given new information, even if the new information would help. Just repeating the same thing again and again makes you so confident in it. What's really surprising about this is that repetition tends to make things seem more believable. Just like repetition. Lots of repetition. Our president is surprisingly good at this. This is one of those things where like this just gets annoying. I could go on forever just hammering this point forward about repetition, lots and lots of repetition, but I won't. You get the idea. Hearing the same thing again and again and again makes you more confident in it than if you heard multiple people confirming it from different sources. This is relevant to Nevada. or a gambling state. All right. So does a player have a better chance of making a shot after you've just made his last 2 shots than if he just missed his last 2 shots? A lot of people think that the player is more likely to make the next shot if they've just made the past couple of shots. There was a situation in which fighter pilots were praised after doing good airplane maneuvers and criticized, blamed when they did poor runs. And it turned out that they tended to get worse after they were praised and better after they were criticized. What ends up happening, like, the praise and criticism actually had nothing to do with it. You didn't need that in the explanation. It turns out that people are just about as good as they are. And sometimes they do better, and sometimes they do worse. And we attribute them doing well based on what we think was relevant recently. Whether it's that we praise them, therefore they did worse, criticize them, they did better. They made their last 2 shots, therefore they're likely to make the next one. The number came up black, therefore it's likely to be red next time. That kind of stuff. None of that's justified. And yet we all think it. All right, let's go through availability and then anchoring. So it turns out that humans are bad at estimating events. We tend to think that if things are easy to recall because they're salient, recent, or familiar, then they're more likely. If they're easy, we tend to think that we tend to err in favor of it. Easy to imagine, or if we have spurious associations, we tend to think that those things are more likely. So we grab the biases in our minds. This can be kind of troubling because a lot of us might have really bad biases. So look at these 2 lists. It's a bunch of names. Which list had more men's names and which list had more women's names? You might actually get the very wrong answer because you instantly honed in on your own name. Maybe, maybe not. I can't even going to tell you the right answer. Are there more words that begin with the letter R than have R as the 3rd letter? So a lot of people find this really, really hard to think about. They try to explore it, and it's really easy to come up with words that start with the letter R. And it's really hard to come up with words that have the R as the 3rd letter. Hard. That's one. I don't know the others. More words. It turns out that because it's easier, we tend to err in favor of it. Now, you might not have in this task because you know that I'm presenting a series of questions that are aimed to like flesh out your biases, your heuristics. But if you ask the normal person without being primed in this particular way, you'd get this answer. Would you rather hitchhike or drive? Hitchhike or walk? This one, I don't really like the reasoning, but it turns out that if you actually look at the statistics, very, very few people are attacked or murdered from hitchhiking. So many more die in car accidents or falling. I don't really love this example. It is historic in the literature, and in fact, I could come up with better examples, but you know, it is what it is. It turns out that we have negative associations, and so we make choices. For example, back after 9/11, people thought that flying was much scarier. After 9/11, people thought terrorism was way scarier than it is, even though that your likelihood of dying in the United States from terrorism or from airplanes is actually really, 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 really low compared to driving that distance or compared to any number of other things. You're dozens of times more likely to die from your own gun than from anybody else's, which is more deadly, homicide or suicide, floods or tuberculosis, tornadoes or asthma. It turns out that if we can think about how bad it would be, we make certain assumptions about them, about how dangerous and scary it is. But when we actually map out the deaths that claim people, like a lot of them are uninteresting, like, you know, eating those extra fries or getting that extra meal over long periods of time is actually probably worse for you than, it's way more likely to kill you than something like a tornado or whatever, vaccination, whatever. Would you rather trust your child to Tom Hanks or Steve Buscemi? Why the hell does physiognomy? Why do you still make these judgments, knowing that this has been deemed bunk science for hundreds of years? Like, prettier people, more conventionally attractive people are more likely to get lenient prison sentences. The world is stacked against people like Steve Buscemi and I. And you person. Okay, let's finish. Last one. And we'll get into these. All right, anchoring effects. We're really bad at estimating events under uncertain circumstances. So we don't adjust based on our initial estimation of something. And we tend to be really bad at understanding certain logical inferences. All right, look at your clock. If it reads an even number, close your eyes right now. I'll tell you when to open them. If it doesn't, leave your eyes open. If your eyes are open, do this. Keep your eyes closed. Just make a quick assumption. Just write a number. All right, everybody else, open your eyes. I'm going to ask you to do a calculation. And I want you to just make a quick guesstimation as to the number. Okay, ready? Just estimate a number. Go. It turns out that when you ask participants this, the way you order it, the numbers matters a lot. So the actual answer to 8's factorial is 40,320. But if you put the 1 first, people estimate a tiny, tiny fraction, something like, what is that, 80th? 1% of the actual answer. Whereas they're likely to guess 4 times higher if you organize the information differently. It's the same math equation. If you put on your driver's license form, opt in to being an organ donor versus opt out, if you have a check this box to subscribe versus check this box to unsubscribe on an email form, most people won't do anything. And so you'll get drastically different levels of participation. In countries where it's opt out, you get in the 80s and 90% of organ donation. In countries where it's opt in, that is, you have to actively check a box to donate your organs, if you get into a car accident or whatever, drastically lower. Very simple change. It's a super important issue, or well, it could be. And people's answers vary so wildly. All right. Here's another example, a very different situation. Linda's 31 years old. single, outspoken, and very bright, majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more probable? She's a bank teller, or she's a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. This is one of those where a very simple lesson in logic should clear it up. When you like give them reasoning, like all of the evidence seems to be consistent with her being a feminist bank teller, and yet feminist bank tellers are a subset of bank tellers. So it's literally impossible for it to be more likely that she is a feminist bank teller versus just a bank teller. Not my favorite example, but it is a classic example. And it shows that we're pretty bad at certain kinds of reasoning. Again. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop this video, and the next video will be on prospect theory.